Okay, we'll make a start and I'll let in anyone else who joins. But good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning on Voice of the Customer in MedTech Development together with EG Technology. So we've got Keller, Beck and Rosette from EG Technology, and they will introduce themselves later on. But I'm going to be recording this so that it will be available for you to view later on. And if you've got any questions, they will be scheduling question breaks after each particular section. And I do encourage you to either use the chat function or the Q&A function, and then we'll be able to get all your questions. If you do have a very strong preference for asking your question in person and to use your mic, then please let me know in the chat function, and then I can actually enable your mic for you. So we'll get started now. I'll just give a brief overview of the Surgical MedTech Cooperative so that you can understand where this link is, and then I will let you get to the exciting part, which is what EG Technology will deliver. So my name is V. Mapunde. I'm the program manager for the Surgical MedTech Cooperative. We're part of the National Institute for Health Research in England, and our particular function is to support the development and evaluation of surgical technologies. There are other mix or MedTech and in vitro diagnostic cooperatives. Some of them deal specifically with in vitro, others just deal with the medical technologies. And here's a map that's sort of showing where we are laid out. And the clue in all of that is if the name of the cooperative starts with the name of a city, then they deal with in vitro. If it starts with the name of a clinical area, then it's just purely MedTech. But you can go on our website, you can have a look and follow the links for these guys. In terms of where we fit in the innovation pathway, we sit in within sort of towards the end of TRL3 to about TRL7. So that's the space that we occupy, and typical activities basically include prototyping support, proof of concept in lab, clinical setting, feasibility studies, pilot studies, all the way to your randomized controlled trials. We often work with partners as well in order to fulfill this because we can't do everything ourselves. And this is where EG Technology comes in, and they will explain a bit about what they do within their talk as well. So we do work collaboratively with different industry partners and academic partners to fill in the gaps. And one of the things we're trying to do as we move forwards this year is to actually have more of these webinars so we can actually showcase the partners that we work with, but also support people who are innovating and developing technologies in terms of finding out where they can get the right support. So just briefly for us, why surgery is predominantly the main sort of activity that happens within secondary care. And we cover sort of the three main areas for general surgery, which are colorectal, vascular, and HPB, which is your liver, pancreas, gallbladder. And last year we added neurosurgery because of the you can transfer certain technologies, particularly between neurosurgery and colorectal. So we decided to add that as well. We are supported academically, and the academic support tends to come in the form of health economics and clinical trial methodology. We also do have digital pathology in there, and we're looking at business development and commercialization. And that really is about making sure that, you know, the clinical validation that we do and all the work that we do is actually going to get you somewhere towards commercializing your technology. We also work very closely with patients and the public. And they are really critical, especially if you're looking at funding applications to the NIHR. You definitely need to have your patient and public involvement. And they're also critical as well in the development of any technologies, which is what EG Technology is going to look at, because the voice of the customer not only includes patients and the public, but it also includes the end users that tend to be the clinicians and other healthcare professionals. In terms of our unmet needs, we have published our unmet needs on our website, and this just gives you a snapshot of the technologies that we prioritize. This is what the NHS will really bite your hand off for. And in terms of sort of summarizing, you know, why we do what we do, it's basically to fill in those gaps. We are there to plug in those gaps either by ourselves or we work together with partners on that. So when it comes to particularly NHR funding applications, we can usually guide people and find collaborators and partners, and sort of help with clinical validation, patient focus groups, and other activities. And finally, the way we do this, we're really about developing collaborations. That's our main reason for existing, is to help you get collaborations, is to give you access into those spaces, is to fund relevant proof of concept projects, and to help you leverage additional funding, which means you can then move further on. So that is the Surgical MedTech Cooperative in a nutshell. We do not operate too dissimilarly from all the other MedTech cooperatives out there. And I shall now hand you over to Kella, and they're going to introduce themselves, and we can get started with the webinar. But as I've mentioned, please type in any questions, any comments in the chat or Q&A functions. We'll be monitoring those, and when it's time for a question break, then we'll go through that, so you don't have to wait till the end of the session. So Kella, Rosette, Beck, over to you guys.
Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. So today, what we want to do is to talk about, I guess, user-centric research. So that is specifically voice of the customer and usability as a key component in ensuring that your medical device is ready for clinical evaluations and the benefits of doing that. So just to start off, a little bit about who we are, EG Technology. We're a product engineering design and development consultancy based in Cambridge, and we do a lot of work helping startups in particularly the MedTech sector. We do a lot of work sort of working from concept right through to transferring to manufacture, sort of bridging that gap between innovation and a market-ready product. So we're really passionate about creating sort of next generation products that really make a difference. We have specialists in multiple different areas. We have electronics, software development, mechanical engineering, industrial design, as well as human factors, project management, and quality. So we can provide really integrated solutions in development. So just to introduce myself, I'm Beck Wilkins, and so I work as a sort of human factors and usability engineer here at EG, and this is...
Yeah, and I'm Kella. I'm a project manager here at EG with a passion for usability engineering. That's why I'm here as well.
So just to kind of go through what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be talking about what voice of the customer, usability engineering, and clinical evaluations are, when you would want to interact with your end users or patients throughout the product development, why that's important, and at the end we're going to do some case studies and examples, just to sort of illustrate some of the tools that we use and the benefits of applying these sorts of methods. So one thing I want to say is that throughout the presentation we want this to be quite interactive. So we're going to be asking a few questions along the way, and then you'll have the opportunity to sort of ask questions at the end of each section as well. So first up, so what is VOC, voice of the customer, usability, and clinical studies? So the first thing to say is that all of these things are really at the heart of a user-centered development. So putting your users and potential end customers at the center of developing medical products. And all of these types of studies involve engaging your end users or patients. They all provide benefits, and and it's really beneficial engaging your users really early on, which I hope you will see sort of throughout the presentation. And each of these are really key at certain stages of development. So one thing I want to point out though is that this presentation isn't about clinical evaluation. That is definitely not our area of expertise. It's more looking at the voice of the customer and usability. So just some sort of definitions to start off, just to put things in context. So voice of the customer is really a proactive type of user research. It's essentially, it aims to understand your customers, what their needs are, what they want, their behaviours, expectations, what their preferences might be, and aversions. And it's typically done really early on in the development of products, so that you can capture user requirements for either that be a product or a service. And it's really key so that you can understand why users think what they think, why they might do what they might do, and it allows you to understand at a really deep level those sorts of insights. And one thing that I really want to stress is that when you speak with users, they will surprise you. So it's really, I think, beneficial speaking and engaging with your users as early as possible, because I have often seen over my many years of experience in this kind of research how you think one thing going into research, the user research, and you come out understanding something quite different. So understanding, you know, how your medical products might intersect with the clinical pathways or user workflows can be really beneficial, and better to know this sort of thing sooner rather than. So a bit of, just again, there's often sometimes a bit of confusion about what human factors and usability engineering is. So just to put all of that in context. So human factors is the study of how humans behave, both either physically or psychologically, in relation to their environment, the products that they might interact with, or a particular process or a system that they're interacting with, and the application of those sort of principles in the design. Usability is referring to more the capacity of that system or product to provide a condition so that the users can use the products to perform their tasks sort of safely, effectively, and efficiently, while also, you know, hopefully enjoying that experience. So usability engineering in the context of medical devices is more around the sort of regulations, whether that be EU, UK or US based regulations. In applying those kinds of principles into the development of medical products, whether that's a device or an IVD or diagnostic device, according to the standard, which is IEC 62366, which outlines a process you go through to assess whether a product's user interface or the user interface elements of it allow it to be used safely and effectively. So that involves understanding the product and its user interface. It involves understanding the tasks that the user needs to undertake, the types of users that are going to use that device, and understanding the environment in which it will be used, and understanding how all of those things play into how it will be used. And there are sort of two ways, general methodologies of assessing something according to usability engineering, or the usability engineering process, and that is either user testing or using risk analysis methods to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the user interface. And then clinical evaluation, as I said, that's definitely not our area of expertise, but just really that's kind of the, you know, testing the medical product or approach in people for safety and effectiveness as a sort of final validation. And that could involve new methods of screening, prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of a disease. Obviously, there are different phases of clinical evaluations, so sometimes these things overlap, these different types of studies overlap. So initially, obviously, there's shorter term studies with fewer participants, building up to longer term studies with higher participant numbers, obviously with the intention of reducing risks to potential participants. But I guess the key thing I want to get across is that each of these three different studies do involve different methodologies and purpose. So just to give you an overview, so with voice of the customer, obviously the intent and purpose of that type of research is about gathering use insight or user insight, or understanding the context of the use, so that you can form the basis of your user requirements for a particular medical product. Usability testing is really where you're assessing the product's user interface elements in terms of use risk. And then, as I mentioned before, clinical evaluation is about the ultimate validation, where you're determining the clinical safety and efficacy of it. Yeah, as I mentioned, these three types of studies can overlap. So, for example, voice of the customer and usability user research, contextual research, can be something that can overlap. Voice of the customer tends to be where you're gathering information that can feed into sort of sometimes commercial benefits or insights, and also requirements that allow you to provide traceability for your regulatory requirements, whereas doing contextual research as a part of the usability engineering process, doing things like observations early on, that kind of thing, can identify characteristics that might impact the safety in terms of its use, if that makes sense. So there are some similarities between these different types of studies, but importantly, there are crucial differences. So, and I guess one of the areas that people often want to double up is doing usability or wanting to do usability and clinical evaluation at the same time, but they do have different intent, and there is quite a few differences in the way you would approach those types of studies. So I wanted to go through that. So obviously I've mentioned that usability testing is about assessing the user interface in terms of use risk versus your sort of ultimate clinical validation. So the first thing to note is that usability testing, the question you're really asking is, what are the clinical implications when a device is used imperfectly versus a clinical evaluation, which is what are the clinical implications when a device is used perfectly? So two different questions. In terms of the study participants, in a usability study, that can be either clinical users and patients, and sometimes you often have different clinical types of users, or even other types of users that might take part in a usability test. In terms of, you know, the numbers that you would test with are definitely different versus a clinical evaluation. One thing to note is that there's usually 2 phases of usability testing. Formative usability testing tends to happen early on in the product development phase, where you're using that testing to evaluate the design concept really early on, as a way of allowing the output of that testing to feed back into the design to improve the design. Whereas later stage usability testing, called summative evaluation, is where you're sort of validating that the user interface is safe and effective to use. So typically, when you're doing early stage formative testing, you're using quite low numbers, sometimes around 5 to 8 users for a quick study, versus summative testing, where you might need to test 15 users as a rough guide. And that's per user group. So, for example, if your product is used by nurses and doctors, or a consultant, surgeon, you would need to test with those different user groups, because they each come with a different set of, you know, skills, experience. They might use the product in a different way, so it needs to be tested based on group. Whereas obviously your clinical assessment is based on the clinical, the patient outcome, and when you're at the later stages of clinical evaluation, that needs to be tested on thousands of patients. So in terms of the use as well, so when you're conducting usability testing, you want to be able to observe the variation in use between different users, where it's in a clinical evaluation that can be very different. What you want to do is minimize variation in use, so that what you're measuring is the patient outcome. When you're conducting usability testing, it's typically only simulated. You're not testing for adverse reactions. So, for example, if you're developing a drug delivery device, you wouldn't be testing the actual drug on the actual study participants within a usability study. Obviously, when you're doing clinical evaluation, then you would be. So you're testing all of those things before you risk testing that in actual patients. And finally, the methodology is quite different as well. So in a usability study, it's predominantly sort of observation based and relying on subjective impression, and interviewing post use of the product to assess the sort of safety and efficacy of it, compared to sort of a clinical evaluation, which is more relying on objective evidence. So I hope that kind of gives an overview of the different methods. And yeah, I guess, do we have any questions at this stage before we move on?
Check the chat.
No, none that I can see.
That's okay. There's lots of opportunities for questions as we go through. So we will stop again. But do just write in the chat if you have any questions.
So I'll pass over to Keller to talk about when is best to interact with the end users and patients throughout the development.
Yeah. Thanks, Beck. So now hopefully know a bit about what these 3 different user interaction elements are, and I want to discuss when they happen, and also where they fit in the broader product development program, and how they interact with different elements in there too. And Bex touched on a lot of this, but what you're looking at here is a sort of simplified roadmap of your product development process, all the way from the initial idea all the way through to launch, and even beyond launch to post-market surveillance. Voice of the customer sits right at the very beginning, even at the initial ideation stage, wanting to get a handle on the user insight and whether there really is a need for your idea, and what that might look like, and the kind of user research that Beck was talking about. Then usability engineering sits in this section of the roadmap, as Beck said, overlapping with that user research stage. That's the first step in usability engineering, making sure you understand who your users are, because everything that follows is based on that. Your design and how you test it is based on who those users are and the context of use. So usability engineering carries you through. You take those user insights that you've figured out, convert them into user needs, which drive your concept generation and detailed design stages, and all the way through to testing. And the testing and design stages are iterative. You'll test, feed that information back into the design, and so on until your design has been frozen and you're doing the more formal verification and validation stages, or at the end, which is at the end of this process, usability engineering. And this overlaps with the beginning of clinical evaluation, as you're starting to prepare for your clinical evaluation, which is your ultimate validation. You'll be finishing up your usability engineering. It's important to note that you need to have finished the usability engineering process before you do any actual clinical evaluations on human beings. The purpose of usability engineering is to prove that your product is safe to use in terms of the user interface, and so you'll need to have proven that before you take that next step. Here's a more complicated diagram, and I don't show you this to frighten you. It's a framework that we've put together over years of experience in this industry. It's our product development program. It's a framework. This needs to be tailored to each project on a project by project basis. So bear that in mind. It is just a framework, but it's hopefully a useful starting point to see all the different things that you'll need to be thinking about during your development. It's in time order from left to right, taking you through the key stages of development: concept generation, detailed design and development, transfer to manufacture, and all the way to market launch. And on the left, you can see the different elements that are interacting with one another. The first one, program management, of course, you need that all the way through. And then the second one down, product design and development, is the core activities that people typically think of when they think of product design and development. And it shows how they interact with all the other maybe less thought of elements, human factors, which is the sort of key thing we're talking about today: risk management, verification and validation, quality, clinical, market access, and intellectual property, all the things you need to think about. The things in block colour in the central part here are the things that we offer and can provide as a service or support you with. The things that are filled white are the areas that we don't cover, as Beck said, like clinical evaluation. But I think that's something that V can help you with from my understanding as well, those other areas. But we're also happy to make suggestions if that's something you need support in for other third parties. So looking at human factors closely, as you see, the human factors process, usability engineering process, starts all the way from the very beginning of your development program right through to as you compile your technical file and look to launch your product. So that's important. You can't leave it till the last minute and shoehorn it in, especially from a regulatory perspective. It does need to be thought about at the beginning and carry all the way through. And as you see, it starts with the user research stage, which overlaps with voice of the customer. I just want to zoom in on this sort of early section for a minute. As you see, the usability side of things, starts with the user research, and that feeds into your URS, your user requirement specification or user needs, which falls under the verification validation section, and that helps you define your product requirements, which feeds into your design. And I'm going to talk a bit more about requirement specifications and traceability in a bit. That's an important area where it overlaps with. Then, as Beck was saying, once you start doing your detailed design and prototyping, those prototypes you'll want to go back to users and test in formative evaluations, where those results it can inform later iterations of the design, and it will be an iterative process, the designing and prototyping and testing through several stages. All of this also interacts with the risk management side of things. Human factors is a risk-based process, and we'll talk a bit more about that when I talk about regulations in a bit, but it closely interacts with those stages, because usability engineering is all about mitigating and minimizing the risk of harm to users, particularly in terms of the user interface. And all of this sits within, all of this interacts with quality and should be defined in your quality management system in terms of processes. So the point I want to make is that they all interact with one another, and certain things need to be happening at the same time, and it's important to have that integrated process, particularly at these stages. Then looking a bit closer at the latter end, beyond formative evaluations, once in the usability process, once you've got final products, that's when you can do your summative evaluations. As Beck mentioned, this is more of the validation step. You have to do it with final products. That's why it's after the pilot units have been produced with your final manufactured design. And also something people often forget are labeling, IFU, which is your information for users, and packaging. The idea of usability engineering is to test the user interface, and those are all user interface elements. They're elements that users interface with that can affect how they perform with the product or service. So those all have to be produced at this point as well and tested with users in your summative evaluation. That all then gets wrapped up in a report with all of your usability engineering files, which contribute towards your technical file. And as you can see, there's lots of other things that are all feeding into that technical file as well. Your other acceptance testing, compliance testing, formal verification testing of your product, as well as, of course, the clinical evaluation, which, as I said, needs to happen after summative evaluation, and that's your final validation step, and all of your quality management and final risk management steps, your risk benefit analysis, all of this kind of thing need to feed into your technical file before you go to notified body review and hopefully launch your product. So that's hopefully now you know what these different user interfacing stages of the product development are and when they happen. So we're going to take a little quiz break. Hopefully everyone will write in the chat, but it looks like we do have some questions, so maybe we can start with just checking the questions. Yeah, Philip, I think you asked if the slides will be made available. Yes, I think this is being recorded, so a recording will also be available, and we're happy to share the slides around as well. Do you assess the IFU and other accompanying documentation with users prior to conducting summative usability testing? Yes, I would recommend you do. Your summative usability test, you don't really want any surprises. That's like your final exam. You want to pass it and not have to do that again, ideally. Sometimes things do crop up, but really you want to have tested everything you need to test and have confidence that it's suitable and safe before you go into your summative, and that includes the IFU and any other packaging, training, anything that's involved in that. As we said, the formative evaluations are an iterative process with the design. So, at the start, there might be early concept sketches that you're testing with users, but it gradually increases with the increasing fidelity of your prototypes. And your last one, we would recommend, that's almost a mock summative. You want to make it as close to summative as possible. You don't influence the users. You test everything as together and just to give yourself confidence.
I guess essentially what you're trying to do in a summative is simulate actual use as much as possible, so that you can assess it from a safety and effective perspective. So that might involve training the users like a day prior to actually conducting the testing, so that you can factor in sort of learning decay, so that it's somewhat representative of the real world.
Okay, keep putting questions in if you have them, but I'll move on to a little quiz section now. So we're going to get get you involved hopefully. So there's going to be 3 rounds of the quiz spread throughout the presentation today. This is the first round, and they're all going to have the same sort of theme or case study, which is that you are developing a COVID-19 lateral flow test, which will be targeted at the general public as an at-home diagnostic. And I know most of you are here through the surgical mix, so it maybe doesn't sound like it'd be relevant to you, but I assure you all of the principles are the same and do apply to surgical medical devices too. And this is hopefully a device that we figured everyone will be all too familiar with and used to using. So it's a good case study in that sense. This particular section of questions, there's going to be 3 questions, and all of the answers that I'm looking for are going to be around which type of user interface, user engagement approach you think will be most suited to the scenario. So I'll give you a scenario, and in the chat box, please just write what you think the answer is, or what you would do at this stage. So we'll start off number 1. Primarily, you want to check using prototypes that users will carry out your COVID-19 lateral flow test as intended, and in particular will not make errors that could result in a false negative or false positive result. You also want to identify any potential areas for improvement in terms of user experience, as now is the ideal time to make design changes in your next round of prototypes. So yeah, please have a go. Let me know what you think. What you think is the best thing to do at this point in development. So you've got early prototypes, and you want to check people can use them correctly.
We've got some answers.
Okay, we've got focus groups, trial different iterations, cognitive walkthrough. That's right. We'll give it a few seconds longer. That's some input. Observation of user understanding of instructions. Yeah, so they're all along the right lines, and all of those are different methods really of formative usability studies. So there are different ways that you can do a formative usability study. Some of them will be walkthroughs, some of them testing your instructions, some of them might be more interview style depending on the stage that you're at. But that's all the purpose, is to get information from real users on how your prototypes are doing to improve them in the next round. So question 2 of 3 for this section. As lateral flow tests are now really commonplace, you think for your diagnostic to be viable and have an edge in the market, it needs to be very easy to use and needs to work with saliva swabs specifically, not relying on nasal swabs, which are horrible to use. This may mean a lot of design and development effort for you and your team though. So before investing lots of money in developing this product, to achieve this, what would you do? Once again, write in the chat box, what do you think you'd do? Yeah, so we've got acceptance of saliva swab by users, interview end user to understand challenges with saliva swabs. Yeah, so really here, you want voice of the customer, user research, primary user research that can help you really understand the true user needs. You've made some assumptions here about what you think the user will and won't accept, and you want to challenge those assumptions and make sure you understand the actual user needs. Yeah, got meets specification of NHS commissioners. Yes, that's true as well. You would want to make sure it more commercially is viable as well. Okay, and lastly for this section, before I go back to talking, this scenario, the design of your COVID-19 natural flow test has been frozen. You've manufactured a pilot batch and conducted thorough functional and performance verification testing that gives you confidence the lateral flow tests have been made right. You now want to validate that once they are launched into the market, they will actually achieve the intended outcome, which is safe, sensitive, and accurate results. What would you do at this stage? So we've got summative testing. Anyone else? So a couple of summative tests, pilot clinical testing, trial alongside existing lateral flow tests to assess performance. Yeah, I would argue they're all correct, and actually you will need to do summative testing, and you'll need to do that first before you do any clinical trials of any kind. And the summative test is to validate that your user interface is safe to use. Before then doing any clinical evaluations, which have a much greater chance of harm for users, because you're getting real diagnoses or having potential therapeutic impact for other products in this case. So yes, both, but crucially summative testing first before moving on to clinical evaluations. Okay, so why are they important? Why should you care about doing these different things for your product development process? And these are the key reasons why they're all important. If you get it right, if you understand your users, you'll make better products, they'll have a better customer experience, and ultimately you'll have greater commercial success. You should also care. It's also important because it's the law. These things are required under the regulations, and also they're required under the regulations because they have an impact on people's safety and the effectiveness of products. So in particular, voice of the customer, if you understand your user and your user needs, as I said, you have a better chance of making the right product for them and having greater commercial success. And the voice of the customer, maybe less obviously, it does also feed into the regulatory side of things through the importance of traceability and defining your user needs, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a bit. Usability testing, once again, understanding your user, but also testing your products with them throughout the process gives you a better chance of making the right product that customers want. Usability engineering 63666 is also required under the regulations, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And once again, there's good reason for it being in the regulations. That's because it can have really serious consequences for safety. Then finally, clinical evaluations, of course, once again, required in the regulations, and for good reason, because they impact people's safety. Going into these three different important areas then, firstly, why it can make you more money. What you're looking at here is CBI Insights, top reasons why startups fail. And there are other rankings like this. Forbes have done one, and there's a few others if you Google it, and they all report very similar things. And you can see here the top reason ranked as why startups fail is that they run out of cash, they fail to raise new capital, and the second one, not far behind, only 3 percentage points behind, is that there's no market need. And sadly, we see this all too often. Is somebody might have a really amazing technology, but it's a technology that no one wants or no one's willing to pay for. Maybe it's prohibitively expensive compared to what they do at the moment, or maybe it's just logistically difficult. Whatever it might be, there are many reasons, and often startups don't get a handle on what the market application and need is in detail. And I would argue that this one, no market need, is in fact connected to the lack of capital. You know, investors know that not having a good handle on the market need is a leading cause for startups to fail, and they will be looking for that, and they're a lot less likely to invest in companies where they don't appreciate that market need. So as well as understanding it for yourself and ensuring you make the right product, it's also important to do the market research to make sure you can prove to investors that you have in fact identified a real market need and can validate that. So what do we mean by market need and market research? So this can be split into sort of 3 core areas. Voice of the customer being the first one, which is part of what we're talking about today. And there's a couple of other areas which we don't typically get involved with, but I want to mention so that to point out that it's also important, and you need to do that market research too, which is the competitor analysis side of things. So I'm sure you're used to seeing tick box charts of your product versus competitors, but it's also sort of broader than that, around understanding your technical advantage and unique selling point, and also the sort of strategies your competitors are taking in the market. And then there's the wider market influences. We're going to talk a lot today about the voice of your customer, your end users interacting with them, and that is very important. But it's also important to appreciate that the users aren't always the people that make the decision around whether your product gets purchased or not. So it's important to understand who the decision makers are that will make the decision to buy your product or not. And that can be particularly complicated in NHS dynamics and the different stakeholders involved. So it's important to understand that, as well as wider market landscape factors, the macroeconomic factors that can affect your industry as well. As we said, our sort of focus today is the voice of the customer and usability side of things. So a little bit more on that in terms of market research. It's all about getting to understand who your user is, understanding the application, the context of use, the various different stakeholders involved, and critically how it intersects with the clinical pathway and existing workflows that are in place to get an overall whole picture of the user, so that you can really, you know, distill out what the actual needs are, not your assumptions. And why that's important is because it can really drive innovation, as you know, as I'm trying to point out here. It can help your commercial success, because if you can understand those unmet needs, those pain points, those are really opportunities for innovation. And by challenging your assumptions at this early stage, you're going to reduce your overall development risk for your product development program, because you're much less likely then to make the wrong product. You're less likely to get to beta prototyping stage and put it in front of a user for the first time then and discover your assumptions were wrong, and that you need to spend a lot of time and money going back undoing that. And it can also provide a helpful sort of direction and vision for the product development team, because you can drive towards what the user need is, and the vision there. So all of that is to say that it means you will be making the right product. You'll be solving the right problem from the start. Okay, so then, as I said, I wanted to go into the regulatory side of things. Oh, my battery's low. Let me just, apologies.
helpful. What kind do we go to?
Do you want to take over for a sec?
Yeah, can do.
I'll hand you over to Beck for a second while I just try and get a charger.
Yeah, so I will continue. So so one of the benefits of conducting really early stage research is allowing you to sort of identify user requirements through the sort of interview process by translating that data from your interview questions into raw data, defining what the insight is based on that primary research. Then you define that as a user need, which you can then translate into a product requirement, which allows you to test against, so you can verify and validate against those requirements. So it's kind of like providing full traceability and linking up that whole loop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Back in the room. So as Beck said, the voice of the customer work helps you define user needs and therefore product requirements, and that's all super important for traceability reasons. So this is the V model. You may be familiar with this. It's technically not actually in the regulations, but it's a very well accepted model that regulators and auditors will be expected to see, and it's a tried and tested model. So you know you'll be safe with it. If you wanted to divert from this, you'd have to have a very good reason and be able to argue your case with auditors. And what this diagram is really saying is that you start with user needs, you trace that down into defining your product specification, you use that to design your product, and then back up on this other side when you're verifying, you need to verify against your product requirements, and then keep tracing that back up to your validation, and you validate against your user requirements. And the key difference here between verification and validation, and therefore the difference between product requirements and user requirements, is that when you're verifying, you're asking, did you design the product right? Whereas in validation, you're asking, did you design the right product? And where the elements that we're talking about today sit on this diagram, voice of the customer, as we said, is at the beginning, and doing that primary user research helps you then define your user needs. The usability testing, you start from that user research side of things, distill out the product requirements, design your product, including the user interface. So this V model applies to your whole product development. Usability is a part of that, but it follows the same model in that once you design your user interface, you're then verifying that it meets your user interface specification, and ultimately validating your user interface, and then moving on to clinical evaluations, which, as we've said, is your ultimate validation step. So more broadly then, in terms of regulations, but firstly to say that the transition from MDD to MDR and from IVDD to IVDR has put much greater emphasis on usability, and that's part of a broader trend over the last couple of decades of taking it more seriously because of incidents that have occurred and a general greater understanding of usability engineering and its impact in medical devices. So the trend is taking it much more seriously, and that's only going to continue. And that's true across the world. So the standard that we've been talking about today, 62366, is European standard, but it's also the basis for MHRA, and the FDA usability process is broadly very similar, and this is considered state of the art. There are subtle differences depending on where you're launching your product around exactly how you might execute a test, but broadly the process is very, very similar. And the process is a risk-based process, so it's a process standard, and it's all about identifying risk, mitigating them, and proving that it's safe. So the bottom line of this regulation is that you must demonstrate that risks caused by a lack of usability are reduced, and that your device is safe and effective to use in the intended use environment by the intended user population in all use scenarios, and that includes reasonably foreseeable misuse as well. Okay, so you know that usability engineering applies to you because you're making a medical device or IVD, and that is the case. It applies to everyone, but in practice, the complexity and the scope of that will vary, and it varies based on risk, which makes sense. You know, the greater the potential for harm, the more you need to scale this process up in your particular product development process. And there's three key questions you can ask yourself about your product to help you determine how critical and how much you need to scale this process for your product. Firstly, does your product or service pose a high potential for serious harm to both users and patients if they're different populations? Is the device or diagnostic used by lay users? And is the user interface complex or novel to the user? And this will help guide you in that question. So how do you go about achieving compliance? And maybe this is an oversimplified slide, but really this is what it boils down to. Make sure you plan your human factors and usability engineering in your development program right from the very beginning and throughout. Then actually do it, actually execute those steps and integrate it into your overall development process, and make sure you then document it all the way along so that you can compile your usability engineering file at the end to form part of your technical file. Okay, the last reason it's important, but arguably the most important reason it's important, is that it can have serious consequences. It can cause harm or worse to the users, and has on sadly many occasions, and that's why people are taking it more seriously. So to put some numbers on that, medical error is the third leading cause of death in the US, only topped by cardiovascular diseases and cancer. And use error, as we call it in the development stage, ultimately turns into medical error, or is part of medical error later. 44% of device recalls are due to design problems, and a third of those involve the user interface. Are those numbers still accurate? Possibly not. The reference that we're using here is from 2000, so the numbers might have changed slightly, but it's certainly still super important. We've made great strides over the last couple of decades to take it more seriously, but there's still a way to go, and we see examples recently as well that still occur. So a couple of specific examples to kind of put it into put a real spin on it. So the first one here at the top, that's a glucose meter. And depending on how good your screen is, you might read that as 2.2 millimoles per litre or 22 millimoles per litre, because the decimal place is not very clear, and that's precisely the problem. And this is a real example, and it led to much higher doses of insulin being delivered to patients, and they got put into diabetic comas as a result, and I believe many of them died. The other example is a simple example. You can mix up medications with something as simple as a colour mix match here, where the colours for the oxygen and the medical air have been mixed up. And especially, this is another good example of why you need to understand the context of use. If this is a stressful A&E environment, or on a paramedic on an ambulance, they don't have time to double check or look closely, and it'll be very easy to give the wrong medication. So hopefully that summarises why it's important for all these different reasons, and we need to consider this all the way through. And we're going to take another break. I've seen a few questions coming in, so let me just have a look at those first. how do you ensure ecological validity during your formative evaluation so that it is reflective of when adopted to clinical evaluation? I'm not sure what you mean by ecological validity. So if you, add a little bit more explanation, I'll come back to that one. Are the numbers still accurate? Yeah, so I sort of saw that as I was going through it. I think you might be right. It's out of date, but it's certainly still a big problem. Not 33% of deaths are the third leading cause of death. That's something. Okay, I think that's the questions. We'll get there'll be lots of opportunities for questions, so keep putting them in, but we'll go into round B of the quiz now. So once again, the same scenario, you're developing a COVID-19 lateral flow test, but the theme of these questions is around user and product requirement specification. So there's 5 questions. I'm going to give you the requirement specification, and I want you to tell me again in the chat box whether you think that's user or product requirement. So first of all, the requirement is the test results shall be easy for the user to read and interpret. Do you think that's a user requirement or a product requirement? And remember that user requirements are from the end user's perspective, what they need, versus product requirements are the functional and technical performance requirements of the product or service. So what do people think? Yeah, someone said user. Any others? We'll come back to your question in a bit, Jeremy. Yeah, so that one's user requirement. The user cares that it's easy to read and interpret. Number 2, the information for use, IFU, provided with the product shall include instructions on when the test result is ready to read. What do people think? User or product requirement for this one? Yes, we've got a mixture this time, and that one was a bit harder. I said this is a product requirement, although it's slightly less clear. It's could be a direct traceability from the previous one. The user just cares that it's easy to read. They don't mind whether that's because of a clear instruction in the IFU or the device speaks to them and tells them it's ready, or whatever method for letting them know that it's ready. Whereas the pre-RS is a bit more of a about how you might do it to an extent, and a way to test that you've designed the product correctly. Number 3, the device shall be compatible with a saliva sample collected via a saliva swab. User or product? Yeah, product here. Actually, it's user. So this one is again a bit ambiguous. This leads on from the earlier part of the quiz that users don't really like nasal swabs and would prefer saliva swabs in theory, if that's the user need you've determined. And the product requirements that would trace down from this are likely to be more technical, what volume of saliva swab you need, what those kind of things. Number 4, the product shall be clearly labelled to indicate that it is single use only. Okay. Product, yeah, I think everyone got that one right. And lastly, the sensitivity of the device results shall be greater than 95%. Yeah, product again, correct. Okay, so that's the end of this section of the quiz. And I'll hand you back over to Beck for case studies. Oh, actually, there was one question that I'll just go back to because it will get lost in the quiz things.
Yeah.
Ecological validity relates to the context of use. So is the device evaluated in the same conditions as it would be in use? Yes, it's very important that you evaluate it in the intended use environment.
But was the question relating to formative studies versus summative studies?
Oh,
So
formative evaluation.
Formative evaluation, you don't necessarily need to test in a simulated environment. It's, I mean, you could do, but it's not always necessary, because what you're looking for is an early indication on sort of the user interaction to provide input into the design. I guess it's one of those things you might want to evaluate on a case-by-case basis in terms of how critical the use environment might be in terms of influencing the safety and efficacy of use. But it's definitely something you need to do as a part of summative evaluation. So sometimes you need to be a bit pragmatic about these things. So often in formative evaluation, they're not done in a simulated use environment, if that answers the question.
If you don't, how are you sure if these interactions are based on poor simulation or poor usability? Yeah, that's the risk you run. That's why it's a judgment call on a project by project basis. For example, if it's a GP surgery, you can simulate that relatively easy without needing to do all the bells and whistles, and if it's depending on the level of harm or risk potential, you can gauge and what stage you're at. We typically get more strict on the simulated use environment in the later formatives versus the earlier ones, because the product, the design is being honed in on its final design, and you're getting closer to the summative, whereas in the earlier stages, if you're asking a particular question or looking at a particular aspect of user interface, you can use judgment as to whether you need to go all out with the use environment, and if you think that's going to have a huge impact or not. So it's a risk that you run, and really, if you want to be really safe in a summative, you want to have certainly tested it beforehand.
Yeah, and I guess that also you're not just relying on user testing to evaluate the safety. That's where risk analysis methods also come into play as well. So you're using both types of methodology to evaluate the design from a usability perspective.
Yeah, and Beck's got some good examples of that in a second. Okay, so I'll hand you back over to Beck for some case studies and examples.
Yeah, so I want to talk us through some particular tools that we use here at various stages of the development, and a few case studies to sort of provide examples of those tools and things that we've kind of found here at EG. So the first example is a piece of voice of the customer research we undertook here. So just to give some context, this device was intended to be a diagnostic piece of diagnostic test kit to detect whether someone had a heart attack within an A&E setting. And our clients came to us with the assumption that this needed to be a small handheld device, point of care device that you would test with a patient right at the bedside in A&E. So what we did was conduct some primary research with a group of potential end users, to sort of, I guess, test that hypothesis. And what we found was that the whole concept of having something portable and handheld and right near the bedside wasn't necessarily suitable within A&E for two key reasons. One was that people didn't want to have to think about managing batteries or dealing with, flat batteries when they needed the device. There's not always one person's responsibility to, particularly when people are changing shifts. There's not necessarily one person responsible for making sure that these devices would be fully powered up. And the other was misplacing a small handheld point of care device. People are busy, they've got managing multiple different patients, in a highly stressed situation. So what we uncovered in the research was that actually, so the assumption was initially that space was a key driver for users, but actually space was less of a driver. So something that was more desk-based, where users could plug it into the wall, didn't have to worry about managing batteries, knew that the thing would always be powered up, and they knew exactly where to go to find the diagnostic to run the test. It didn't need to be done right by the bedside. So this was a really important early stage insight that meant that we didn't go off developing something that was small and handheld, and we could have spent a lot of time and money developing the wrong thing, so we essentially mitigated that. So the next example is again a tool we use, which is called sort of the 6 Ps method, which is where you're mapping out things like the process, the place, the purpose of each step within a user workflow, and this example was with a client that we were mapping, or where we were mapping out the clinical pathway alongside the user workflow for a particular cell culture process that they are in the process of developing. And what we found from mapping out that whole process was we identified very time critical steps where those two processes intersected. So what that meant was that they had to redevelop their cell culture process sooner rather than later. So obviously finding out these things early means less time and money is wasted. So moving on, so as we've sort of mentioned, risk analysis and usability studies are two really important evaluation methods of evaluating the user interface of a medical device. They're definitely the two core methodologies used, and there's the reasons that you would implement both are that they can uncover different potential use risks. So risk analysis is a really important method of capturing risks that you can foresee, so things that the development team can imagine might happen in a clinical setting, and it means often employing risk analysis methods are cheaper and easier because they don't involve user studies, so they can be a really effective way of evaluating. But when you're doing user studies, obviously you've got a limited number of users that you're testing with. It allows you to capture unforeseen risks, things that you just don't anticipate. But the benefit of risk analysis is that you can identify things that might happen but don't you might not observe in a user study. So it's really important to actually, to use both methodologies. so that you can mitigate that risk. And here's obviously a little example of similar code, I'm trying to identify potential use errors relating to a COVID lateral flow test kit. So another example for usability testing, and this is relevant for a surgical tool that we were involved with developing. We didn't actually do the usability testing. That was done independently, but what we've found was the tool we were developing for it to function relied on friction to sort of on a spring to hold the mechanism in place. And what we uncovered throughout by doing sort of simulated usability testing was that the tissue had a significant impact on the device function, because the tissue was so slippery it impacted the ability of the mechanism to grip, and so again, something you want to uncover sooner rather than later into development, so that you can actually then redesign your product to mitigate that potential risk. So I hope that highlights some benefits of undertaking this kind of research throughout the development program. So next I want to do another quiz, and this is looking at identifying potential use risks related to a COVID lateral flow test kit. So I'm assuming you've all got experience of using these kits for the last few years, and I imagine you've probably or can imagine quite a few different things that a user might do inadvertently or incorrectly that could lead to a potential sort of either generally a false negative result or a false positive. So if anyone wants to put in the chat box some examples of things that they think a user might do incorrectly.
I see you. There's a question from Jeremy, but we'll come back to that.
Okay.
I reckon. But any other use errors that people may have done themselves doing these tests?
So as an example here, we've got one where the user might confuse the control line to mean, so the C means COVID rather than that the test has been completed correctly.
And this is a simplified version of the risk analysis table as well, where you'd actually have scores on this probability and severity to give you overall sort of risk scores, and those will help you determine what you do about it, which isn't shown here. So there's one: drop the fluid into the wrong place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pour too much fluid into the sample. Yeah, and it's what we've talked about with this example before is there's lots of different lateral flow tests now on the market, and they work slightly differently, and so you might use one that says 6 drops and then you don't bother reading the IFU for the next one that says 2 or
something. Yeah,
they might swab the wrong place. Yeah,
swab wrong bit. They might not swell into the buffer long enough. So you can see that there's lots of things that a user might do or might do incorrectly, unintentionally, that could impact the result.
Not washing your hands. Yeah, I'm sure loads of people don't bother. So in the interest of time, I think we move on to the last bit of this, which
so the next step of obviously, once you've identified all these potential use errors, is then you would think about, I guess, once you've identified what the potential hazard or harm might be of that, where the harm has, you know, is something that could lead to something quite serious, then obviously you want to look to mitigate those sorts of things. And there are different ways of mitigating through, it may be through changing the design, might be updating the instructions for use. But as an example, we've got here one, you know, if you wanted to mitigate this design, then maybe you develop a smartphone camera and app to read the result to sort of prevent that issue from happening. You can imagine there's other different ways of getting around that potential error.
So yeah,
And then
yeah, I've only got a few minutes left. So
do we have any questions?
Yeah, any last questions?
Bakantala, there is a question that we missed on labeling by Jeremy. If you can just.
Oh yes. From a user's perspective, the C and T and S labels are confusing. Why are they used? Yeah, why are they forced to understand clinical terminology? I guess that's a very, very specific product question. And it as we said, the risk analysis, you've also got to score those. You know, some risks, yeah, that someone might make a mistake, but if the actual harm from that is minor, or the probability is very low, and you're going to have a risk document with lots of risks, and you'll never mitigate everything fully, and at the end you have to do a risk benefit analysis as well to sort of to show that the benefits outweigh the risk. And I guess the developers of current lateral flow tests on the market could argue that they've mitigated risk to a reasonable degree, and the benefits outweigh the risk in that current format. And I guess now people are used to it. So you probably have trouble doing something different now because people are used to the C and the T and the S. Yeah. And while some people might get it wrong, if actually you find in your testing that that's rare and most people get it right, and a different embodiment causes more problems than that one, then, you know, there's a lot of things to take into account there as to what's the best user interface.
Yeah, so understanding what the convention is really important, because that will, you know, what are people's mental models. You know, it might be that 1 in 1,000 people might get this wrong, but actually, generally speaking, most people might understand what those letters mean. So it's understanding whether it's better to stick with convention or move away from it, and assessing what's the likelihood based on those two scenarios.
Yeah. So the competition.
Yeah, is that it for questions?
Oh, I think someone's typing, but while we're waiting.
In the meantime, yeah, I just want to highlight that at EG we are marking our 20th anniversary here this year, and because of that, we want to we're putting together this competition where we're offering either somewhere between 2 and 5 complimentary engineering days to startups, essentially. So to apply, basically all you need to do is explain what your innovation is or what your solution is, highlight which aspects of the product development that our engineering day offer would help them with, and how that will help them with their future plans. You should be developing physical devices to take part and have been successful in raising funds previously, and have your sort of a clear idea of your route to market. So if you're interested, then you can send your expression of interest to the following emails, which is design@egtechnology.co.uk, outlining a description of your innovation and solution, where you are in the development stage, what sort of the support that you require for the engineering days, and how that will support you to enable you to move towards that market launch. So the closing date for this will be the 15th of September. And yeah, so yeah, I think you've got it. If you've got any other questions, then you feel free to email us. But yeah,
I'm conscious we might be out of time. If anyone has any questions, do please drop them in the chat, or if we have completely run out of time, feel free to email us. If email us about the competition, but also feel free to email us questions, or if you have anything else you want to get in touch about.
Yep. So thank you, Keller and Beck, for that very detailed, informative session. And as they've mentioned, I will be sharing the slides and a video out as soon as Microsoft Teams tells me it's completed that. And there will be contact details as well. So if you've got any additional questions or you want to explore anything else with EG technology, then I strongly suggest that you get in touch with them after this, and you can follow up on those conversations. You know, otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for staying, for listening and asking the questions and participating. And we hope to see you for one of our future events. So thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Right.